palace had weathered storms before: scandals, rumors, family fractures, but nothing like this. When King Charles made a sudden decision to cut Camilla's long-standing ties within the royal inner circle, even senior staff were left frozen in silence. Royal guards reported hushed radio chatter. Advisors spoke of a heart-wrenching moment behind closed doors. And the question hanging in the air was one no one dared to voice: what pushed the king to break a bond that once seemed unshakable? Things were no longer calm inside the palace walls. They were cracking. If stories from inside the palace fascinate you as much as they do us, hit the like button, it really helps. And if you enjoy deep dives into the emotional, human side of the royal family, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I share this video with someone who follows royal news obsessively. We all have at least one friend like that. Morning at the palace usually carried a predictable rhythm: soft footsteps on polished floors, clipped radio murmurs from the royal guards, and the steady movements of staff who knew their routines down to the second. But on this particular morning, something felt off long before anyone understood why. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't an announcement. It was the absence of normal life, a thin layer of tension floating across the corridors, as if the walls themselves were trying to hold their breath. Guards stationed at the East Gallery noticed it first. One veteran guard, who had served through 3 administrations, later said it felt like the air changed temperature, like a storm moving in but without clouds. He couldn't explain it, but his instincts, honed from years of watching every small shift in posture, tone, and expression, told him something significant was brewing. And when guards feel something before the advisors do, that's when you know the palace is entering uncommon territory. At around 8:10 a.m., King Charles was scheduled for a routine briefing. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, short, concise meeting. But the advisors who entered the room saw an expression that made them pause mid-step. The king sat at the end of the long table, his fingers steepled, his gaze lowered. Charles often carried the seriousness expected of a monarch, but this was different. This was quiet conflict, something heavy, something personal. Yet he said nothing. He just nodded for them to begin. And they did, though even the most senior among them felt the unease tightening through the room. Why? Because Charles was listening, but not hearing. His mind was somewhere else entirely. Meanwhile, in the West Wing, Camilla's staff were preparing her engagements for the week. Everything looked perfectly normal. Fresh flowers, pressed notes, the usual warm chatter. But even among her team, small whispers carried questions. A couple of calls had been delayed. A briefing packet that should have arrived at dawn didn't. A planned joint appearance with Charles hadn't been confirmed. It wasn't alarming yet, but it was strange. At 9 a.m., a subtle shift rippled through the palace, a series of sudden schedule adjustments. Someone close to the senior aides said that the updates didn't just change timings, they changed tone. Meetings were moved, phone calls were rerouted, conference that should have included Camilla was quietly reorganized without her name on the list. That was the moment people began exchanging glances. Royal guards are trained to stand still for hours, but they see everything. They catch the small glances, the half-finished sentences, the tension in a walk, the way an aide holds a folder tighter than normal. One guard described a senior official walking past with the pace of someone trying not to run. That's when we knew, he said. Something big was happening. It wasn't public yet. By mid-morning, the palace had slipped into a strange, almost cinematic quiet. People moved, but cautiously. Conversations happened, but in hushed tones. Phones buzzed behind partially closed doors. Even the guards at the main entrance adjusted their stance, not because of protocol, but because instinct told them this was the kind of day where news travels faster than breath. Then came the moment that made the entire atmosphere shift from uneasy to undeniably serious. A private secretary, one of the king's most trusted, entered the briefing room with a file pressed to his chest. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't panicked, but he was purposeful. His expression said more than words ever could. When he handed the file to Charles, the room felt like time had paused. Advisors watched as the king took a long breath before opening it. Inside, according to those who later spoke under anonymity, was the formal documentation outlining the changes Charles had been contemplating for weeks. A restructuring of roles, responsibilities, and positions within the monarchy's inner circle. And the most shocking part?
The king didn't speak
Camilla's name was included under
Instead,
the list of ties
he
to
rested
be
his hand
altered,
on the document
reduced,
for
or
several
ended.
seconds, as if acknowledging the emotional weight attached to it. Those who know Charles will say he carries decisions painfully when they involve people he's close to. And Camilla, she had been more than a partner. She had been a confidant, an anchor, a companion through some of the most turbulent years of his life. To adjust her role wasn't just administrative. It was deeply personal. Just outside the room, guards heard nothing, but they sensed everything. One guard said later, "It's strange how silence can feel louder than shouting." That was one of those mornings. And he wasn't wrong. It was a kind of silence that makes people straighten up without realizing it, the kind that carries weight. Around the same time, staff loyal to Camilla began noticing things they couldn't explain. A call from the king's office that was unusually short. A note requesting a pause on several events. A courier carrying sealed envelopes headed toward the queen's quarters. Small pieces that didn't yet form a picture, but one that intuition warned was coming. By noon, whispers had spread even to the public-facing guards near the gates, an extremely rare occurrence. The royal guard culture is built on discipline and professionalism, but they're still human. They see the panic in a junior aide's eyes, the strain in a senior staffer's steps, the uncertainty in a private secretary's voice. They don't gossip, but they notice. And on this day, they notice a lot. Still, no one knew the full story. Not yet. Everything reached a quiet but powerful turning point shortly after lunch, when Charles requested a private moment, alone. Something he does only when the emotional weight of a decision needs space. The staff who saw him walk through the corridor said he looked composed, but not peaceful, determined but conflicted, a man preparing to do something he believed was necessary, but that he wished didn't have to be done. In that moment, the palace wasn't just a historic building. It was a pressure chamber. Every hallway felt tighter. Every footstep echoed louder. Every silence stretched longer. Even the guards felt it, especially the one stationed outside the king's study. They said it was like standing beside a door that separated two futures, one familiar, one uncertain. And then the king issued the order, the decision that would ripple through the royal household, through staff, through advisors, and eventually through the world. Camilla's roles, responsibilities, and certain ties within the inner royal structure would be formally brought to an end. The silence that followed was more than silence. It was shock. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the first raindrop had fallen. When the king finally made the decision, the palace didn't erupt into chaos. It sank into a deeper, heavier quiet. The kind that settles when people realize something irreversible has just happened. Charles had always been a man who weighed every choice with extraordinary care, but this one carried a unique gravity. Ending Camilla's ties, especially after years of shared history, loyalty, and support, wasn't merely administrative. It was deeply human, and that human weight pressed into every corner of the palace. What many people don't realize is that this decision wasn't made in a moment of anger or sudden impulse. It was a slow, painful conclusion shaped by weeks of internal conflict. Those closest to the king said he had been wrestling with contradictions, duty versus affection, stability versus sentiment, responsibility versus comfort. One advisor described it as watching a man drag himself through emotional mud. Not because he wanted distance from Camilla, but because something larger, heavier, demanded it. The pressure had been building long before the staff sensed a shift. Private conversations with senior constitutional advisors highlighted the complexity of upcoming transitions of power, expectations from the government, and the necessity of presenting a unified, streamlined monarchy to the public. There were issues of public trust, optics, responsibilities, and disagreements that had surfaced behind closed doors, issues that could no longer be ignored with gentle diplomacy. Camilla had her own obligations, her own relationships, her own style of doing things. Some within the palace loved her directness and warmth. Others struggled with her influence circles, which did not always align with the king's newly tightened vision for future. And this future, according to those in the highest tiers, required a reset. Not a fracture, not humiliation, but a recalibration, a closing of certain chapters, so new ones could take shape. Still, knowing something must be done doesn't make doing it any easier. Charles had carried that burden for days. His staff recalled nights when the lights in his study burned far past midnight. Aides delivering documents would see him sitting with his glasses low on his nose, a pen in one hand and an untouched cup of tea beside a stack of reports. His mind was not on paperwork. It was on the emotional cost of the decision he knew he couldn't avoid much longer. In those late hours, he would sometimes pause, stare at the ceiling, and breathe the kind of breath that belongs to someone deciding between two painful truths. You don't have to be a king to recognize that look. It's the look of a man who knows he's about to change the life of someone who has stood beside him for decades. But the turning point, the moment that transformed hesitation into action, came during a private council meeting held 2 days before the formal decision. A senior official, someone Charles trusted deeply, presented a comprehensive report outlining potential long-term risks of not restructuring certain roles. It was clinical, organized, but what struck Charles was a line written near the end. Stability requires clarity, and clarity sometimes requires letting go of long-standing attachments. Those words lingered. They didn't give an order, but they revealed a truth Charles could no longer deny. And it wasn't about Camilla as a person. It was about what the monarchy needed to become to survive, evolve, and function without public doubts or internal misalignment. Every monarch faces a moment where crowns and emotions pull in opposite directions. This was his. The morning of the decision, Charles requested a small meeting with 2 individuals, his private secretary and a long-standing advisor who had served the crown for decades. Witnesses later said it was one of the most solemn gatherings they had ever seen. Charles listened quietly, asked questions slowly, and weighed every answer like a man evaluating the cost of each breath. Not one person in that room believed he wanted to do this, but every person believed he felt he must. And so, when he finally authorized the restructuring document, the same one placed before him earlier that day, the advisors maintained a respectful silence. It wasn't a triumphant moment. It wasn't even a decisive one in the traditional sense. It was a soundless acceptance of a responsibility that comes with the crown, making decisions that hurt even when they're necessary. Once the order was finalized, a wave moved through the inner royal system, touching departments, staff, and high-level coordinators responsible for immediate implementation. No one shouted instructions. No one panicked. But the pace accelerated. Printers hummed. Secure lines buzzed. Documents were sealed with signatures that carried centuries of weight. And at the center of it all, the king sat in quiet stillness, his hand resting over the closed folder, absorbing the emotional reality of what he had just set into motion. Meanwhile, Camilla remained unaware of the formal decision. She continued with her scheduled tasks, unaware that several of the people around her had already received private notifications instructing them to prepare for structural shifts. Some of her closest aides later admitted to feeling torn. They wanted to warn her, to give her a moment to brace herself, but strict confidentiality bound them, loyalty to her battle with duty to the crown. And that battle showed in the stiffness of their posture, the slight tremor in their voices, the way their eyes lingered on her a little longer than usual. By late afternoon, the king requested a short walk through the private gardens. A single security detail accompanied him, keeping a respectful distance. Observers said Charles walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, gaze drifting toward the ground as though searching for answers in the pattern of gravel beneath his feet. When he paused near the rose beds, Camilla's favorite section of the garden, his shoulders dipped. For a moment, he looked like any man facing a painful goodbye. Inside the palace, staff maintained their professionalism, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Royal guards at the interior posts noticed it immediately. Guards are trained to observe micro-reactions, tightened jaws, rapid steps, clipped tones. One guard later described it as watching a family brace for the truth they can't postpone anymore. At 4:50 p.m., the formal notice, the one Charles dreaded but knew was essential, was delivered to Camilla's team. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't dramatic. It was dignified, respectful, carefully worded. But nothing could soften the emotional blow of its meaning. Her official roles were being recalibrated. Several positions dissolved and certain ceremonial ties ended. When Camilla was informed privately, those present said she didn't raise her voice or break down. Instead, she sat very still. Her initial question was simple, quiet. Did he decide this alone? The aide who answered chose honesty over comfort. No, ma'am. But it was his final call. Camilla's expression didn't crumble, but something softened, something hurt. She had always known the monarchy demanded sacrifices, but this one cut deeply, not because it was political, but because it came from someone she loved and supported for decades. Meanwhile, Charles remained in his study, waiting, knowing that the moment she learned the truth would be the moment the true emotional cost of his decision began. He didn't pace. He didn't distract himself. He simply waited, because sometimes the hardest part of doing what's right is facing the heartbreak that follows. And as the palace settled into an uneasy evening, one reality became unmistakably clear. This wasn't just a royal restructuring. It was the most personal decision Charles had made since becoming king. While the palace absorbed the shock of Charles's decision, another pair quietly stepped into the emotional vacuum forming at the center of it all. Prince William and Catherine, the Princess of Wales. They had not been present in the king's study when the final signature was placed on the restructuring document, but news travels quickly at the highest tiers of royal life, especially news that stirs the very foundation of the family. William felt the shift before he heard the details. As heir to the throne, he had grown deeply attuned to changes in tone, posture, and atmosphere inside the palace. Even as he returned from an engagement earlier that afternoon, he sensed it instantly. The guard standing a touch straighter, aides speaking in clipped whispers, the unusual stillness that comes when a private storm is brewing behind closed doors. Catherine sensed it as well. She had a gift for reading people, and the moment she stepped to the side entrance with William by her side, she exchanged a glance with him, one that said, "Something's wrong." Within the hour, the couple were fully briefed. William listened intently, his expression tightening not in anger but in concern. He understood the gravity of the decision. He also understood the emotional cost it carried for everyone involved, his father most of all. Catherine remained seated next to him, hands folded in her lap, absorbing the details without a trace of judgment. She knew this family had weathered more than its share of storms, but this moment wasn't just political or procedural. It was deeply human. Has she been told yet? Kate asked quietly once the explanation was complete. The aide shook his head. "Not yet, ma'am. Soon." Catherine exhaled slowly. Her empathy was one of her greatest strengths, and the idea of Camilla hearing such difficult news alone bothered her deeply. But she also understood boundaries. There was a time to step forward, and a time to let the king's decision unfold with dignity and privacy. As the palace moved into the late afternoon, William and Kate did what they always did in moment of tension. They stepped forward not with grand announcements or dramatic interventions, but with calm, steady presence. They made their way through the corridors, greeting staff with warmth, offering reassurance without speaking directly about the unfolding situation. For the people who worked within those walls, seeing William and Kate moving with purpose and composure steadied the emotional landscape more than any memo ever could. Royal guards noticed a change immediately. Guards are trained to remain silent and still, but they feel tension as much as anyone else. When William entered the east corridor, several guards later said the atmosphere shifted. "He carries this anchoring energy," one guard explained. "When he walks by, it's like someone opened a window and let air back into the room." Catherine had a similar effect. Her presence brought quiet steadiness, the kind that soothed without words. Late in the day, William requested a brief meeting with his father. No advisors, no secretaries, just father and son behind closed doors. A guard station outside said the room was silent for several minutes. No voices, no movement, followed by a single low murmur from William. They weren't arguing. They weren't negotiating. They were two men connected by a crown that demanded more from them than the world often understood. Witnesses later described the meeting as gentle, supportive, and honest. William knew his father had made a painful decision, one he didn't take lightly. And he also knew that what Charles needed wasn't analysis, wasn't strategy. It was reassurance. Reassurance that he wasn't alone, that the future of the monarchy was steady, that the family would hold together even through emotional shifts. When William left the study, he didn't reveal what was said, but his expression, steady, resolute, compassionate, spoke volumes. The guards who observed him said he walked differently after that meeting, like a man who had accepted a new layer of responsibility. not just as a future king, but as the anchor of the family in a moment of emotional upheaval. Meanwhile, Catherine focused her attention where it mattered most: the people. She visited the staff quietly, speaking with those who were directly affected by the restructuring. She didn't pry or ask for details. She simply offered a calming presence. One staff member recalled, "She has a way of making you feel like everything will be all right, even when she isn't saying it outright." For staff who were confused, worried, or torn between loyalties, Kate's gentleness meant more than she probably realized. As the evening approached, the palace was preparing for the moment William and Kate both knew was coming. The first encounter between them and Camilla after she had been informed of the king's decision. There was no official plan, no stage moment, but the palace is small in its own way, and paths inevitably cross. Camilla was found in one of the quieter sitting rooms shortly after the notice had been delivered. She was not crying, but her posture was still reflective, heavy. When William entered the room, he paused, giving her space. He has always been deliberate in moments of emotion, never rushing, never overwhelming. Camilla looked up, and for a moment, there was a flicker of vulnerability between them that only close families ever witness. William approached slowly, offering not consolation, but respect. He didn't pretend the decision was easy. He didn't offer hollow comfort. Instead, he simply sat with her, letting silence speak where words might have felt intrusive. Catherine joined a few moments later, sitting beside Camilla with a soft, steady presence. She didn't touch her arm or speak too quickly. She just existed beside her, giving her the dignity of being seen, not pitted. Observers who kept a respectful distance said it was one of the most human scenes the palace had witnessed in months. No titles, no roles, no hierarchy, just a family navigating pain together. As the night settled, William and Kate stepped into their other role, the public face of stability. They worked with senior staff to ensure that the next day's schedule would reflect normalcy, that communication lines were clear, and that any leaked interpretations would be handled with careful, respectful accuracy. They did not overshadow the king's decision. They supported it by ensuring its aftermath would be navigated with dignity and unity. Before retiring for the night, William checked on his father once more. The visit was brief but meaningful. A simple hand on Charles's shoulder, a quiet nod, a shared look that said everything neither man needed to put into words. Catherine ended her night the same way she began her day, with empathy. She ensured the palace staff got home on time, made small gestures of kindness, and brought a sense of calm to a day that had been filled with emotional turmoil. She didn't do it for praise. She did it because she knew that in moments of upheaval, the strongest thing anyone can offer is steady, humane grace. And so, while the king carried the weight of decision felt around the world, it was William and Kate who created the emotional landing place for everyone inside the palace. Their presence didn't erase the pain, but it gave the palace something it hadn't felt all day. The morning after decision, the palace felt different, not tense, not frantic, but marked by a quiet sense of recalibration, the kind that follows a storm that didn't break loudly, but one that soaked everything in its path. Staff entered the corridors with cautious steps, unsure of the emotional temperature. Royal guards posted at the major junctions observed a change they couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't fear. It wasn't mourning. It was a weight of transition, the atmosphere of a royal household adjusting to a new reality that no one could ignore. King Charles rose before the sun. Insomnia wasn't uncommon for him, especially after days of emotional strain. He stood by the window in his private room, watching the faint gold of dawn cut across the palace gardens. The roses glowed softly under the early light. Camilla's roses. The sight brought a tightness to his chest, a tug of memory that was sharper than he expected. He didn't regret the decision, but the emotional cost lingered like an ache beneath the stern facade of kingship. He knew the day ahead would be filled with questions, internally, politically, and eventually, publicly. The monarchy was an institution built on careful balance. Every adjustment, every shift, every clarified boundary sent ripples across the system. Today, those ripples would reach far, and Charles, as always, prepared to face them with dignity. By mid-morning, the palace's communications team convened to design the language of the public explanation. Not a statement, not an announcement, something gentler, crafted with respect, clarity, and precision. William and Kate joined the strategic discussion, bringing their signature calm to the room. Their presence anchored the conversation. They didn't speak over others. They didn't dominate the room. Instead, they asked the questions that mattered most. How does this sound to the public? Does this protect dignity on all sides? Does this maintain unity while still being honest? Kate's input was especially valued. She had a way of reading how messages would land with everyday families, with mothers, with young adults, with the millions who watched the royal family not as political figures, but as human beings navigating extraordinary expectations. Her guidance helped shape the tone, soft, steady, and free of sharp edges. Behind the scenes, Camilla was navigating her own quiet aftershocks. Her schedule had been cleared for the day, not as punishment, but to give her the space she needed. She spent the morning in a private sitting room, reading letters, reviewing memories, letting herself move through the emotional terrain at her own pace. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defeated. But she was undeniably wounded. When someone you love makes a decision that reshapes your life, even if you understand the why, the how still hurts. Yet even in her pain, Camilla displayed a grace that surprised those around her. She did not lash out, complain, or retreat into bitterness. She asked questions, practical ones, thoughtful ones. She ensured her team felt supported, even as her own world shifted beneath her, and those who serve her felt a protective loyalty grow even stronger. In moments of upheaval, people reveal their truest selves. Camilla's quiet strength earned deeper respect than any title ever could. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened, something that shifted the emotional trajectory of the entire palace. Charles knocked on Camilla's door. The moment was private, unseen by cameras or advisors, but its symbolism was powerful. A king acknowledging the woman who had stood beside him for so many years. A partner acknowledging the pain he could not shield her from. Witnesses didn't hear the words exchanged, but they saw the expressions afterward. Charles leaving with softened eyes, Camilla with a faint, understanding nod. It wasn't reconciliation in a dramatic sense. It was something smaller and far more meaningful. Acknowledgement, respect, human connection, despite everything. Once that moment passed, the palace seemed to breathe again. Royal guards reported that the atmosphere shifted from suffocating to solemn but stable. Staff said the energy felt steadier, less fragile. The royal household, an ecosystem built on centuries of structure, was adapting, slowly but surely. By late afternoon, attention turned to the future. William and Kate were at the center of these discussions, offering ideas, perspectives, and a steady sense of direction. It was clear to everyone watching that their role in the monarchy's next chapter would be larger, more defined, and more essential than ever before. They weren't replacing anyone. They weren't stepping into conflict. They were doing what they had always done, stepping forward with integrity, empathy, and quiet authority. As the day progressed, advisors pieced together what the new reality would look like. Certain ceremonial roles previously associated with Camilla would be absorbed by other senior members. Some by Charles, others by William and Kate, and a few by trusted working royals who understood the importance of duty over spotlight. The structure wasn't just slimming, it was sharpening. The public would eventually see this transition not as a scandal, but as evolution. Royal watchers would analyze the shifts. Critics would speculate. Supporters would empathize. But inside the palace, one truth stood out more clearly than any headline. The decision was made for the long-term stability of the institution, not out of spite or division. As evening settled, the family gathered for a private dinner, an unspoken attempt to restore a sense of normalcy. Not everyone spoke much. Some moments were awkward. Others were unexpectedly warm. But the simple act of sitting at the same table sent a message stronger than any official statement. Families bend, they don't break. William kept watchful eyes on his father. Catherine kept gentle attention on the room's emotional balance. And through it all, Charles carried himself not as a king wrestling with guilt, but as a leader who had done what he believed necessary, even if it hurt. When the night finally quieted, the palace drifted into a weary but hopeful calm. Guards resumed their silent posts. Lights dimmed in the long windows. Voices faded into distant echoes. And in that stillness, the new royal reality settled into place, not with theatrics, not with triumph, but with a quiet, dignified acceptance. The monarchy had shifted. The roles had changed. The emotional landscape had transformed. But one thing remained clear and unwavering. The royal family would move forward, together